psychological conditions have become more accepted in society, and we've started to look at different ways in which the workforce can improve their um, psychological health within the office and all sorts of things of that nature. We've also noticed that an improved psychological well-being contributes to overall productivity in society. So, as many of you may know, with the healthcare ethics program at Duquesne, we are given the opportunity to do clinical rotations within the hospitals in the local area. So, we can shadow physicians and also go in the local ICUs as well. And while I was shadowing, I noticed that many patients are presenting in the hospital with psychological conditions that are going either um, diagnosed but untreated, or patients are receiving treatment but are obtaining no relief. So as a result of this, I started to think about, how can we help these patients? And currently this semester, I'm taking a genetics and ethics class. So I started to wonder, what if we could use our understanding of genetics to edit out these genes that cause psychological disorders? So, in order to kind of understand where we're going with psychological conditions, we need to gather a solid understanding of where we currently are in genetics with physical conditions. So, CRISPR is a very big thing in genetics right now. It stands for clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. And CRISPR was discovered through E. coli bacterium. And basically, the simple explanation of this is identical repeated DNA sequences were found in E. coli bacterium. So, to simplify that even further, when your body gets a virus, the DNA of that virus is duplicated and a DNA copy is stored within the body. So even though that virus leaves the body, there's still a DNA copy of it stored. So then when that virus attacks the body on a different occasion, the virus can be invaded because your body's already stored the DNA. So the DNA for the virus is then cut and the virus is ultimately destroyed and you don't receive symptoms anymore. So ultimately, for physical conditions, this has allowed for advancements within genetic sequencing and also has simplified gene editing therapies and the reliability of that process. So, when I think about genetic and therapeutic interventions for physical conditions, I broke it down into three main categories: diagnosis, treatment, and eradication. So, basically, all of the research that we currently have for physical conditions for genetics and therapeutic interventions falls into one of these categories. So, for diagnosis of physical conditions, we're able to genetically sequence various physical disorders now. So, for example, breast cancer, the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. So, we were able to genetically sequence breast cancer to know that BRCA1 gene and the BRCA2 gene determine susceptibility to breast cancer. So, this is something that's been talked about a lot frequently, and I'm sure many of you have heard of. This can allow for early intervention with breast cancer. So, for example, if a woman goes to the doctor, she has a very long history of breast cancer in the family and gets genetically tested and comes back positive for the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, she can then determine if she wants to undergo a double mastectomy in order to prevent that cancer, the breast cancer, from occurring. So, moving on to treatment for physical conditions, genetic sequencing has allowed for more targeted treatment methods within the body. A primary example of this is for desmoid tumors. Research was done on desmoid tumors, which are basically non-cancerous, fatty tumors within the connective tissue of our muscles. And we were able to enhance treatment methods because we were able to genetically sequence these desmoid tumors. We were able to make more targeted treatments in order to eradicate these tumors. Similar with the coronavirus, we've been able, I'm sure many of you have heard now, we've been able to genetically sequence the coronavirus in order to understand this disease further and come up with enhanced treatment methods and vaccine development. The one problem with the treatment methods for physical conditions that we have right now in genetics is most of these require multiple treatment administrations. So that means that, number one, they don't prevent the illness or the disease from occurring. So, for example, although we can, we have targeted treatments for the desmoid tumors, that doesn't mean we can prevent the desmoid tumors from occurring in general. So we can treat those desmoid tumors, but there's still a chance that those desmoid tumors could come back and need to be treated again. And then on to the eradication phase for physical conditions. This is where therapeutic gene editing comes in. So therapeutic gene editing offers a permanent correction for a disease within the human body. One disease that was studied in a lab environment on rats was cystic fibrosis. And cystic fibrosis is a mutation of the CFTR gene. So a mutation of this gene leads to fluid retention and diminished ion transport, and that leads to the primary symptoms of cystic fibrosis itself. So while genome editing isn't currently utilized in the United States, there is a potential for full disease eradication with therapeutic gene editing. So again, what that means is we're able to eradicate the disease entirely before it even occurs within the human body. All right, so now moving on to the psychological disorders portion, I decided just for the sake of this research to focus on bipolar disorder and schizophrenia disorder. So for those of you that don't know, bipolar disorder is characterized by episodes of mania and depression. So what that means is extreme highs and extreme lows. So family adoption studies were explored to kind of determine the risk factor associated with family members and developing bipolar disorder. So interviews and family histories were taken. So basically how this was done was they took a group of individuals, interviewed them, and gathered all their family history. So history of each individual within the family that has bipolar disorder. And it was found that individuals with first degree relatives with bipolar disorder are at a 10 times higher risk of developing the condition compared to controls that haven't been affected by bipolar disorder. So what these studies have found was that there is some sort of genetic relationship between bipolar disorder. So it's prompted further research within the field to kind of determine what's really going on with bipolar and genetics. So researchers have further explored genetic risk loci within bipolar disorder. And what these are locations on a gene or a DNA sequence of a specific chromosome. So this allows us to pinpoint the exact location of a gene to determine its responsibility within the body. So for bipolar disease or bipolar disorder, they've done linkage studies that have explored multiple genes within the body, and they found an association between bipolar disorder susceptibility and the ANK3 gene, the DGKH gene, and so on. Although they've noticed many associations between bipolar disorder and different genes as far as heritability goes, no gene by itself has independently been linked to bipolar disorder. All right, and moving on to schizophrenia disorder. So for those that don't know, schizophrenia disorder is characterized by symptoms such as extreme hallucinations and delusions. It can also cause extreme behavioral disorders, and 20 to 30% of these patients experience resistance to treatment. So again, family studies were done with schizophrenia disorder, and they determined that the heritability of schizophrenia in traditional families, so these are families that do not have adopted children or anything of that nature, and their extended families was 44%, which again suggests some sort of genetic link in schizophrenia disorder. So further, these linkage studies again were done similar to what was done with bipolar disorder, and found that many chromosomes can be associated with schizophrenia disorder. So for example, the 1q, the 2q, the 6p, 8p, and so on. So researchers continue to explore schizophrenia with symptom development as well. So basically trying to determine whether we can predict what symptoms a patient with schizophrenia is going to develop in the future. And one of those common symptoms is hypersomnia. So that's basically the opposite of insomnia. So it's sleeping an excessive amount. So through these types of studies, we're able to predict the symptoms that may occur in schizophrenia before they even occur in the patient. Right. So now that psychological disorders have become more prevalent within our society, they're becoming more accepted, they still are very difficult to treat. Oftentimes, patients need to see therapists for a while, and if that doesn't work, they may need to try all sorts of medications. So this is where pharmacogenetics comes in, and this is researched in both bipolar and schizophrenia disorder. And these are exploring individual genes in the human body and their response to medication. So this can improve an individual's response to different drugs. So with psychological conditions where they can be hard to treat, we're able to pinpoint which drug we think will work based off of an individual's genetic makeup. It also improves dosing and can also allow us to mediate potential side effects. So it's been found that based off of certain genetic characteristics that individuals have, they may be more susceptible to experiencing nausea, for example. So we're able to kind of play around with different medications to get the best response from individuals. All right, so my main argument here and where the ethics comes into play for my research is the pain and suffering aspect associated with physical symptoms and psychological conditions. So both of these conditions are very similar in the pain and suffering aspect. You know, with physical conditions and psychological conditions, you have psychological symptoms. Physical conditions, you obviously have physical conditions, and psychological conditions can even manifest themselves into physical symptoms. You have strained relationships and losses of employment. But where these two types of conditions differ is psychological conditions are treatment resistant in some cases. So when I say that, that sounds similar to terminal conditions in a physical condition. So for example, when we think of terminal conditions, a lot of people think of cancer. But when an individual has a physical terminal condition, we still allow for symptom management. So although the disease may not be able to be cured all in all, like a terminal cancer cannot be cured, we're able to alleviate their pain and suffering. So for example, right now we have palliative and hospice care. And for those of you that don't know, palliative and hospice care is more of a comfort care. It focuses on making sure the patient is comfortable, is not receiving, and is not suffering from intense pain or discomfort. So they're able to be medicated with painkillers to assist with this, or sleep medication to help them sleep better. So with psychological conditions, when they are treatment resistant, and let me just clarify, treatment resistant in psychological conditions involves a correct diagnosis, adequate treatment, and no response to treatment. So basically what that means, although there is some argument on the correct definition for treatment resistant, all of the definitions involve that correct diagnosis, the adequate treatment, and no response to treatment. So what this means is with these treatment resistant disorders, there's absolutely no symptom management. So with psychological conditions, there's no palliative care offered, there's no hospice care offered. So although their condition can't be cured, it's still, their pain and suffering cannot be managed. So they're forced to deal with debilitating symptoms such as hallucinations, delusions, and pain and suffering that comes as a result of these conditions. All right, so if we think back to the beginning of the PowerPoint when I was discussing genetics and physical conditions, and I broke it up into 3 different categories with our progress of genetics currently. So we have just a reminder, diagnosis, treatment, eradication. So with psychological conditions, we are currently able to genetically sequence some psychological conditions to determine susceptibility in individuals. We do have some targeted medication therapies for these individuals with psychological conditions, but where the issue lies is patients that have treatment-resistant psychological conditions still are non-compliant with these medication therapies. So again, they're receiving no relief for the pain and suffering that they're enduring. So moving on to the eradication phase, that's where gene editing therapy comes in. So I believe that since we aren't able to offer patients with treatment-resistant psychological disorders any sort of relief for their pain and suffering, we need to consider allowing for gene editing therapy so we can eradicate these diseases before they occur within the human body, so that we're preventing that pain and suffering that comes as a result of these conditions. All right, so this is a work in progress. So since I don't have my official conclusion yet, I wanted to put a slide that's my next steps with my research for the rest of the semester. So that's basically just continuing to develop the suffering associated with treatment-resistant disorders and discussing aspects of resiliency associated with gene editing. So that means talking about the reduced healthcare burden, if we're able to edit out these disorders before they occur. Also, job retention rates will increase because patients suffering from bipolar and schizophrenia typically have high rates of job loss. All right, thank you.
Is there any question from the audience?
A quick question. This is Luke. Gabriella, great job. And I'm interested in your work because I'm in the clinical mental health counseling program here at Duquesne. So I'm very interested in hearing about, mental health treatments and evolutions in them. Do you foresee gene editing therapy that can be something that becomes mainstream, or will it kind of remain a luxury is the wrong word, but more of a niche treatment for people, So I just wanted to ask you that.
Yeah, that's definitely a really great question. So, where I foresee this going, I think so. Right now, as I kind of mentioned with some of my research in the psychological conditions, we're not able to pinpoint one gene to each psychological condition right now. So, right now, we're just kind of looking at associations between certain genes and kind of how they play a role in different aspects. I think that if we're able to pinpoint a specific gene to each condition more definitively, I think we have a better chance of this becoming an actual treatment option for individuals. Because as we've seen, and I'm sure you know, because this is kind of your discipline, we're kind of at a standstill with a lot of treatment for psychological conditions, especially with the treatment resistant kinds. And that's kind of where I started to toy around with this. And I feel like we have to start becoming progressive and think of something new and innovative in order to, come up with something to help these patients.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay, so we will move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Zara Wenzinger from the Bayer School of Natural and Environmental Sciences, Department of Forensic Science and Law. Her faculty advisor is Dr. Pamela Marshall, and the project of her presentation is The Relevance of Current Forensic Firearms Examination Techniques when Applied to 3D Printed Firearms.
Okay, is this showing at all, the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
we can see it.
So I'm speaking about the relevance of current forensic firearms examination techniques when applied to 3D printed firearms. 3D printer firearms or guns sort of seem fictional, but they are indeed real. 3D printing technology has become more accessible to consumers in recent years, to the point where you can buy one on Amazon for under $200. And this leads to numerous things being printed on them, including firearms. These pose a threat to public safety because they are untraceable. They're not registered with the government, and you don't really need technical skills to make them. This research looks to answer two questions. Can firearm and tool marks examinations be successfully applied to 3D printed firearms because there's no rifling that is done to their barrels? And will thermoplastic residue be left behind from a 3D printed gun? And can that actually be detected during routine gunshot residue testing? And both of those questions answer the bigger question, are these really untraceable firearms? So in 2013, the first 3D printed firearm was posted online by Cody Wilson. It was called The Liberator. He published it so anyone could download the files for free. There have been many subsequent firearm designs posted, and now they can, in theory, successfully fire multiple consecutive rounds. So they are advanced a lot in recent years. There's only one federal law that governs these firearms, which is the 1988 Undetectable Firearms Act, which makes any firearm illegal if they do not have at least 3.7 ounces of metal in them to set off a metal detector. Now, there are certain state laws like New Jersey and California have laws that deal with manufacturing, but there's no federal system yet in place. There have been instances of arrests in other countries. The biggest two instances that I'm going to mention is in Israel and the UK, where fully assembled 3D printed firearms have made it past security. In Israel, on 2 separate occasions, they were brought into a prime minister's address. And in the UK, they made it successfully from England to France on the Eurostar train, which has similar TSA level security. And in the United States, there have been at least 2 separate incidents where TSA has seized a 3D printed firearm with ammunition at the airport. Neither of these incidences resulted in any arrests. There's limited research that has been done on this subject, specifically relating to forensic science. In 2017, a paper was published that examined thermoplastic residue left on bullets, cartridge cases, and clothing using DART MS. And in 2018, a 2-part paper examined firing pin impressions and rifling patterns from 3D printed weapons. My research actually looks at 4 major objectives. The first was to successfully print the Liberator using files downloaded off the internet without modifications to see how feasible this actually was. And then it was to use gunshot residue stubs to test for the presence of thermoplastic microparticles and heavy metals commonly associated with gunshot residue on the palms of someone who had recently handled a freshly 3D printed object. This is sort of compare to see if the 3D printing process would cause false positives in the later gunshot residue testing part. The third objective was to actually fire the Liberator and to test for the presence of gunshot residue and thermoplastic residue on the bullet, cartridge case, barrel, and a piece of plastic that was obtained from the firearm after the shot. And the fourth objective was to identify any individual characteristics that might have been deposited during the firing process by the firearm. I'm going to go through each objective in its entirety, methods all the way to conclusions, so we're not jumping around all the time. So that first objective was to print the gun. We used the Liberator model, that original 2013 published firearms schematic. It was found on github.com, and it was printed using a printer that was on Amazon for about $190 using PLA, ABS, and nylon filament, all of which can be bought on Amazon for under $20. The only piece of metal that was used for function was a 1-inch roofing nail that was used as a firing pin. These are very common. We got ours from Home Depot. You could probably find one on the ground. The non-barrel parts took about 19 hours to print. They are pictured to that right there. And each barrel took 14 to 15 hours to print. That was just due to changing some of the printing specifications, specifically how closely the plastic was deposited on top of each other to make the barrel just a little bit more sturdy. The barrels were printed using PLA, ABS, and nylon to test for the different filaments. Although only the PLA barrels fit the .380 ammunition without any modifications by hand, the other barrels did have to be sanded a little bit for some extra stray pieces of plastic that were in the way. During assembly, a little bit of sanding had to be done to ensure ideal fit. This was mainly doing the connecting pins so that the firearm could be easily assembled and disassembled quickly. The printing process was inexpensive and relatively quick, especially for states that have 3-day waiting periods on guns. This was a lot faster, and most firearms are more than $200, so this is a cheaper option as well. It did prove to be difficult when changing the thermoplastics used from the ones that were suggested in the files. So modifying the plastic used would require a little bit more technical knowledge on the 3D printing side, not the firearm side. The second objective was to look if the printing process would interfere with later testing for thermoplastic residue and heavy metals. So we used the barrels for this process, and we tested each for thermoplastic microparticles and lead, barium, and antimony, which are the 3 major components of gunshot residue. We took 3 samples per barrel, 1 before handling to serve as an environmental control, 1 after handling, and 1 after washing your hands. All GSR stubs were analyzed using SEM EDS, which is what forensic analysts use to look for gunshot residue. We weren't able to find any thermoplastic particles identified through a gunshot residue specific analysis, but there was also no presence of lead, barium, or antimony in a way that could be interpreted as originating from firing a gun. So there was one component particles there, but those are unlikely to be definitively associated with gunshot residue, and they seem to have come up mainly from the surrounding environment since they were also present on that control sample. This eliminates the ability for anyone to claim that gunshot residue resulted from the 3D printing process of the object and not from actually firing it. But more research should be done into the use of sturdier thermoplastics, other 3D printers, and even changing the parameters of the print, since changing that nozzle temperature and bed temperature could affect how these things get extruded out into the environment. Then we actually fired it. We used Allegheny County Medical Examiner's Office, their firearms section, let us use the remote firing cart. We fired it into 18 inches of newspaper. For safety and to limit repairs in between successive fires, the trigger spring was removed and the spring connecting rod was replaced with a stainless steel dowel pin. The trigger spring just lightened the load of us having to manually cock the gun, increasing safety. It didn't actually affect the gun in any way, shape, or form. What it does is it just pulls that trigger back forward afterwards, but since you have to manually reload each bullet, there's no real need for that. And the spring connecting rod was replaced so that replicate fires could be done without having to replace it every single time. After the firing, the bullet, cartridge case, barrel, and a piece of plastic were collected, and gunshot residue subs were applied to each sample, and then they were also analyzed using SEM EDS analysis for gunshot residue and thermoplastic residue. There were several failed attempts due to misalignment of the firing pin and the trigger pull not catching the trigger. But we did get one successful round off, which cracked the right side of the frame. The hammer mechanism was completely destroyed and the barrel was ejected from the frame. That lower right-hand picture is what the Liberator looked immediately after firing. Only the trigger and the grip survived in entirety. The bullet also only penetrated 3 newspapers, which is about 3/8 of an inch, and tore through an additional 4 newspapers, which is about 1/2 an inch. So you can see how close that newspaper box is to the Liberator in that picture above. So the bullet didn't really have much penetrating power, we found. Going back to that analysis, the cartridge case, bullet, and barrel gunshot residue subs were analyzed using a pre-made program that is used to analyze for gunshot residue. All 3 samples met the maximum threshold for 100 3-component gunshot residue particles, and then the analysis stopped. During a manual confirmation of all the 3-component particles, we looked around for particles that could be thermoplastic particles. We identified 21 on the cartridge case, but later excluded one based on its properties. 3 were identified on the bullet, and 1 was identified on the barrel. The suspected thermoplastic particles were identified by their shape, their EDS spectra, and the fact that they melted during analysis. So this picture on the right here, you can see it's a 2-part picture. The image on the left, you can see an arrow pointing to a little white box. That is where the spectra is being taken, and that picture on the right is what happened after that spectra was taken, and you can see it burned a nice hole right through the middle of it, and that hole that's next to it, you can actually see it pushes out because whatever that particle is, it is melting out. We also looked at a piece of plastic from the destroyed hammer mechanism. After carbon coating it because it was plastic, it needed a little bit of work done before we could put it in the SEM. And we did this manually. We didn't run it underneath the automatic program. And we found at least 3 different 3-component gunshot residue particles. And then we stopped the manual analysis. After that, you can see a picture of one on the screen. This is really important because it means small bits of broken plastic can be submitted as evidence and analyzed for gunshot residue. This gun broke into a bunch of different pieces. It was very hard to find all of them. Most likely that is what's going to be at a scene if a 3D printed gun is used. Potassium was present in a lot of the spectra of the suspected thermoplastic particles, As of right now, its source is unknown, but it could be from coloring additives used by the manufacturer. We used several colors of plastic, but those coloring additives are proprietary business secrets, so we don't know what they are, but additional research should be done in order to determine that source of potassium. Additional research should also be looking into determining the velocity of the bullet after firing to determine its lethal capacity, because this research could eliminate the threat of the Liberator entirely. If it can't, if it doesn't have a large wounding potential, it's not really a threat that people need to consider. And additional methods of instrumentation commonly found in forensic laboratories should be explored for further identification of thermoplastic particles. That 2017 paper used DART-MS, which is not instrumentation that's commonly found in forensic laboratories and might not ever be sent out to use. So analysis such as FTIR, GCMS, LCMS should be investigated to see if thermoplastic particles can be identified. And then our last one was to look at the bullet in the cartridge case under the microscope to identify any individual characteristics deposited during the firing process. Neither the bullet or cartridge case exhibited any individual characteristics that could be used for identification purposes. No rifling or unique striae were found on the bullet, and no firing pin was recovered from the cartridge case. This only indicates that there was no rifling on the barrel and that there was primer blowout, not that a 3D printed firearm was used. But what we noticed was the barrel did not break during firing, so replicate frames could be printed in future research so that comparisons between replicate firings could be made, because the barrel could be switched between frames instead, and to see like if the any individual characteristics show up that can be identified. For the future, additional firearms should be printed different models, especially the sturdier models, and different thermoplastics should be compared. Nylon is a very strong plastic, but it's very difficult to print with. PLA is a softer plastic, but it is a lot easier to print with. So there's pros and cons to these plastics that people can consider. Additional research should be done into looking at different 3D printers and different plastics, and larger sample batches should be used. Additional research should look at how the velocity of the bullet, the source of potassium, and how to confirm the presence of thermoplastic particles using laboratory equipment standard in a forensic lab. And additional frames should be printed so that replicate firings can be conducted. This will also establish if that primer blowout was unique to this firing instance, or if it is a common occurrence due to the unique structure of the 3D printed firearms. And the two pictures here, the top one is the barrel, and you can see the two lines from when it hit the back of the hammer, and you can see that primer sort of burnt in there. And then the bottom is what we were able to recover of the hammer mechanism after firing. You can see, even as we flipped it over, more pieces broke off because it was so fragile after firing. And I would like to thank Dr. Viator, Ben Barnarding, and Jacob Salvatore from the Department of Engineering for assisting in the 3D printing of the firearms. I would like to thank Allison Leneve and the RJ Lee Group for the use of their facilities in addition to their guidance support. Thank you to Ray Everett and the Allegheny County Medical Examiner's Office for the use of their facilities. Thank you to Detective Colehep for contributing much needed guidance about the legality and law enforcement implications for this research project. And thank you to Dr. Marshall and Wetzel from the Duquesne University Forensic Science and Law program. Any questions? I think you're muted.
Miss Angela, you're muted.
If you actually if you look up at the top of your screen, you'll see the microphone and then the camera. Just click on the microphone and you should be unmuted. I don't think we can unmute you. Oh,
Hey, Angela, I tried to unmute you and it's not working. Can you just type your question? Okay, so Angela says that she's not familiar with guns and didn't know the comparison from these guns to regular guns. So you mentioned the size of newspapers and the damage done. Is that comparable?
So, unfortunately, recently newspapers haven't been used to fire into we now use water tanks. But yes, from what was done years ago before we had water tanks, there was a reason we had to put 18 inches of newspapers, and that was from the Allegheny County Firearms Office. They said that would be enough, hopefully, to stop it. So the fact that it didn't even penetrate an inch was significantly less than we all expected. It does depend on the gun, the ammunition. It's not only the gun, but different ammunitions have different amount of primer in them, and therefore will go further. So there's a lot of factors there. But pretty much all firearms that are sold commercially have the lethal capacity, whereas this, we're not sure. We don't think it could.
Zara, I was wondering, have there been instances where, and I know that it seems like the technology and that information being out on the internet is still, all things considered, relatively new. But have there been incidences like among law enforcement where they're seeing these printed guns out on the street? It seems like it's a kind of cool that your research is kind of getting ahead of, what may eventually become a problem, but is it something that you're seeing them in common use yet, or at least being, picked up off of people, or, sort of what prompted the research?
So they have been picked up. There, I think, has been 1 or 2 arrests in the United States, where people have been arrested with 3D printed guns or partially printed 3D printed guns. A lot of the arrests come from overseas, specifically countries that are islands, that it's not as easy to get firearms, such as Japan, Australia, the UK are seeing arrests of people printing these. Law enforcement, unless they're breaking other firearms laws or it doesn't have metal in them, they're not illegal. And if you're following your local municipality and state's laws, you are well within your rights to carry one. But again, that it has to have metal in it. As I said, like TSA has seized them, but they've never made a charge with that. In terms of general legality, there has been a push to prevent the sharing of these files. The main one is the Justice Department does take down the files while it's actually in court right now. The argument, though, isn't that it's a firearm blueprint. The argument is that since the internet is open to other countries, it's illegal to sell weapon schematics to foreign countries. So that's where it's having a legal issue. But certain sites have just asked to provide a US address and then you can download it, and that's totally fine. But the website I downloaded it from was pulled down, I think, a day later from the internet. I think New Jersey is the only state that actually has barred 3D printed guns, but again, it's right back through the appeals.
Are there any more questions? So we'll be moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Angela Godwin from the School of Nursing. Her faculty advisor is Dr. Melanie Turk, and her presentation topic is the bariatric surgery process as experienced by Black women.
Angela just emailed me and she is restarting her computer. So she might be a few moments. Now, we are running over, which is fine, but I just wanted to let you know that in the case that we run out of time and this knocks us out, I've created another session that continues it right in the same symposium platform. So you can all just go back to the website and click join now, and we should all come back in if at 2 o'clock this mysteriously stops. I hope it doesn't though. That's the hope. So there's Angela. Can you hear me, Angela? Are you in Chrome? Oh, you can type into the chat. Oh. There's not a phone number. When you entered in, did you have your microphone on when you entered in, or do you have it muted? If you log out and log back in and make sure your microphone is on when you enter, that might help. I'm when you actually come in, your browser usually asks you if you like it has your name and then it has a picture of the camera and the microphone. So if those are X'd out when you first enter the room, then you might not be able to talk right away. Thanks. So, in an effort to keep things moving while we wait on Angela, Kathleen Wilson has offered to go next, and we'll just wait on Angela.
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me all right? Okay. Oh, Angela's back.
Angela is back.
Oh, can you hear me maybe through my phone?
Angela, are you able to hear and speak? Angela, are you able to hear and speak?
I can hear, and I'm using my phone. I connected through my phone. So you see two of me up here. One is my phone and one is a computer.
Okay.
Does that work?
I hear an echo, but you're speaking really fast, but it might work.
Okay, I muted my computer.
Okay, that's
Do you
much
still
better. Are you?
hear an echo?
No, that's good, I think. Oh, and just remember, if it cuts you off, everyone just go to the session that I made. I apologize for this.
Okay. I'm opening up, hoping not to have other problems with sharing my screen. Okay. Let's see. Okay, let's try. Does that work?
Yep, looks good.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yep. You're good to go.
Okay. Let me know if something's not working. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Is the moderator there? Or was I ready? Did I miss that?
Yeah, you were introduced.
Thank you so much. So again, thank you for this opportunity. Um, this was a study I conducted in fall of last year, 2021, looking at the experience, the process of Black women going to bariatric surgery. And just a special thank you to Dr. Turk and Dr. Zuha for going through this process with me. It was a great learning experience. So I feel like we all know that obesity is an ongoing issue. It's even gotten worse since COVID, unfortunately, and those numbers haven't all come out yet. But we know that since 1975, obesity has tripled. Worldwide, since 2016, we've had more than 1.9.
Angela, we can't hear you. Angela, we can't hear you.
Okay, everyone, I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties. So if everyone could just log out of this one, I just made a Zoom meeting for the other session, and it should be showing up under live sessions for session 2. It says session 2, additional time. So just hopefully we can just log into the Zoom and we'll have a lot better luck there.